Welcome to 2819. I'm Sandra Dimas.
And I'm Daniel Almaguer.
What? Who are you?
Oh my gosh.
Well, Brian couldn't be here today, so
Right.
I'm glad you're joining us today, Daniel.
Happy to be here.
We have a great show today. We're going to be talking about good and bad evidence for God.
Right. In Everyday Apologetics, Darren Williams explains what counts as evidence. And that's the one that I'm actually really excited for.
No, definitely. I love that. In Science Faith Connection, Jeff Swerenk will be chatting with Ken Samples, and they're going to be asking the question of how we know Christianity is true.
First up is Culture Talk. Sandra here will be interviewing Fazale Rana on Laminin.
Laminin. What is that?
Laminin, and is it bad evidence for God?
Let's check it out. Now it's time for Culture Talk, where we talk about culturally relevant topics that you can use to start conversations about your faith. I'm joined today with biochemist Fazale Rana. Welcome.
Sandra, thanks for having me.
You know, we're going to be talking about good and bad evidence for God's existence. And there is one thing that I remember you've written about before called laminin that was used as good evidence, but maybe isn't. So can you explain first, what is laminin?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because when people find out that I'm a biochemist and they're Christians, the first thing they oftentimes want to do is talk to me about laminin.
Yeah.
And they're so excited because they see this as very powerful evidence for God's existence. But again, as you said, it isn't really. But laminin is actually a very important protein. It's part of what's called the extracellular matrix. So you have cells that actually secrete materials that form a matrix that the cells then are embedded in. So they kind of create their own environment. And these molecules that they secrete are different types of proteins and different types of polysaccharides that form this extracellular matrix. And laminin is one of those proteins. And it happens to have what biochemists would call three subunits, alpha, beta, and gamma. And the alpha subunit is a long fibrous protein, and the beta and the gamma subunits are shorter fibrous proteins that attach to the alpha subunit about midpoint. So it forms a cross shape. And it has a number of binding sites that can bind other proteins, polysaccharides. It can bind a protein in cell membranes called integrin. And as a result of this, it kind of holds the extracellular matrix together, and it kind of holds attaches cells to cells and anchors cells in that extracellular matrix. So it kind of is a glue type material that's holding everything together.
So I already see then the connection. It's like, all right, we've got this cross-shaped protein that holds everything together, just like Christ holds everything together. And this is evidence that God is in even the creation of cells and proteins and all of that.
And that is his fingerprint is in each one of the cells in our body, right?
And it's beautiful. It's beautiful to make that analogy, except it's not true, right?
Well, I mean, it's fine if you look at something like that and it prompts you to worship or have a devotional experience, but it's not something that you want to present to a skeptic, to a non-believer as scientific evidence for a creator, right? And there's a number of reasons for this.
Right.
You know, one is that a T-shaped material isn't necessarily that unusual. It's a fairly simple design. It occurs all over the place in nature. So why are you necessarily singling this out? But also, in reality, the laminin molecule, even though we see it represented like in biology textbooks as a cross-like molecule, its arms are actually quite floppy. So it's really in a highly convoluted, folded state when it's holding everything together. Biochemists just represent it in textbooks as a T because it helps you to visualize the overall molecular architecture and where the different binding sites for different types of proteins and polysaccharides exist. So it's really a tool that biochemists use to get insight and to communicate about the molecule.
And is that the actual shape of it, or what does it look like?
It is T-shaped, but but it's highly convoluted. So the fact of the matter is it probably looks more like a swastika in real life than actually a cross. It's very unusual if it would be actually truly cross-shaped. now I've seen people record electron micrographs of laminin,
Mm-hmm.
and there are electron micrographs where it again is T-shaped,
Mm-hmm.
but that's just an artifact of sample preparation. More often than not, those electron micrographs show a highly folded molecule. So it's an elegantly designed molecule to be certain to serve its role as kind of an attachment, for a number of different molecules to kind of create integrity to the extracellular matrix and anchor cells to one another and to the matrix. But it's not really truly cross-shaped in real life.
Right. And it's good to kind of stop the presses there before saying, hey, this is a cross-shaped thing, and it shows that the God of the Bible is the one who has left his fingerprint everywhere. But just to say, like, let's marvel at the design and appreciate that, but not take it to that next level, because again, you're saying it kind of represents more of like a swastika. That's not a shape we want to be advocating for. So that is then an example of, taking something that is elegantly designed, but then inserting a story that doesn't quite fit. And unfortunately, that gets, shared across, the internet. People continue to share it. So that's an example of, like, would you say that's an example of bad evidence for God's existence? Okay.
Yes.
So then where do people go? Because they're going to stumble upon this and other arguments for God's existence. How do they check to see what is valid and what is questionable at best?
Yeah. Well, what I like to do is look at the history of how people have philosophically, or traditionally how people have philosophically argued for God's existence, and then look at how the scientific evidence can be used to bolster these philosophical arguments. So that one of the classic design arguments is the watchmaker argument of William Paley, where he was comparing, attributes of human designs with attributes of biological systems, showing the similarity. And so we can do the same kind of thing with biochemical systems, where there are these remarkable biochemical designs that are eerie in terms of their similarity to human designs. That would be a better approach. And there's some fascinating, remarkable biochemical systems like molecular motors and DNA computers and all kinds of cool things that I think can be used to make a bona fide argument for design.
Right. Well, and you've written plenty about these design arguments in your book, Fit for a Purpose, and also elsewhere. So I think for anyone who's curious, they can definitely check out Fit for a Purpose. Are there some, aside from the molecular motors, and I think you said DNA computers?
Yeah.
Any other things that you would point our viewers to say, hey, these might be some good things to check out when you're looking for good evidence? Yeah.
Well, to me, ultimately the information content of biomolecules is really provocative, because biochemical systems are information systems, and we know from experience information comes from a mind. But what's remarkable is that information is structured in the same way that we would structure information. And so the similarities to me are quite eerie and really provocative.
Thank you so much for that, Fuzz. We're barely touching the surface on this topic, so if you want to learn more about it, go to reasons.org and look for Dr. Fazale Rana's blog, The Cells Design. You can also find his book at support.reasons.org. Search for Fit for a Purpose.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink here. Welcome to our discussion. As I spend time out on the internet dealing with Twitter and talking to people and following various arguments, one thing that often comes up is this claim that you need to show me the evidence. And often what I find is when you put out a piece of evidence, people go, that's not evidence, it doesn't count. And so I'm excited today because we've got Dr. Darren Williams. He's a professor of chemistry at Sam Houston State University. And we're just going to talk about that question. What actually counts as evidence? Darren, it's good to have you here today.
It's great to be here.
So let's kind of just delve into that a little bit. You do have this sense that what counts as evidence for me doesn't always count as evidence for people. So is there an objective way to define evidence, or how do we look at this challenge to provide the evidence, if you will?
Yes, I think that's a great place to start in any conversation, especially when you're dealing with these topics. And it's great to go to the crime shows. Everybody loves a good crime show. I teach forensic chemistry at Sam Houston State, and we talk about the courtroom all of the time and what counts as evidence. And not everything is scientific evidence.
Okay.
A lot of times people set that as the only evidence that they want to consider, but that's not the way the world works. We have historical documentation, we have personal testimony, eyewitness testimony. We also even have personal experience and expert witnesses.
So I mean, I could see where at some level that all counts as evidence, but does all of that carry the same weight? Or I mean, if I come in and I say, hey, this is what I see, this is what I think, I mean, I could just be outright lying. Whereas,
exactly.
I found a ball in a photograph. It seems like there's different level of evidence there.
There is, but in a court of law, then those witnesses, if you will, would be challenged. You wouldn't bring in an arsonist to talk about DNA profiling.
Okay.
And so you would look at, is this person reliable in their testimony? And so not everything is just scientific.
Okay.
You have other kinds of expert testimony that you would bring in and actually lend credence to.
So if you had somebody, for example, if you're talking about, hey, what does this mean, if you will, having a theologian or a philosopher or even a historian who studies linguistics or something, they're weighing in and saying, hey, this is what this means. That counts pretty strong as evidence, even though it's not scientific evidence, if you will.
Exactly. And so I think that's a good thing to point out to somebody who seems to have set their filter to the setting of only letting science through. If you're in a discussion with someone, you say, look, we could talk to archaeologists, we could talk to historians, we could talk to theologians.
So it kind of gets, it seems like at some level you're having to talk what counts as evidence, or what is evidence to the person, and seeing whether they really accept things as evidence, but then also recognizing that there are a pretty broad set of what counts as evidence, and on the other, kind of going along with that, you don't really get the choice to throw out certain kinds of evidence, if you will.
Right. I mean, you're going to make your own subjective decision on what compels you, but I think it doesn't make a lot of sense to just say, no, I'll only accept scientific evidence. We don't run our lives that way. We don't do that in a court of law, and we don't do that, when we go across the street to a sketchy-looking restaurant.
So kind of, that's fair. So from the perspective of you're dealing with someone who says, okay, show me the evidence, and you do put some evidence out there that you think is interesting or compelling.
Yes.
When they come back and just respond, oh, that doesn't count because of this, that, or the other, how do you respond, and what have you found effective in kind of moving the conversation forward from this is what I like, this is what you like type thing?
Yeah, I would just sort of drop it back down to the sources and discuss why they think the way they do, and try to get them to self-reflect. Am I setting the bar so high here because I don't want to deal with the conclusions that are coming if I accept that? And so I really just talk about why it is the person is setting the bar in this area differently than they might be setting it in other areas of their life. And one of those things is giving credence to what I would say experts in different fields. We talked about the arsonist not being asked about DNA evidence, and it's bothersome nowadays too to hear physicists who have PhDs in physics, very challenging degrees, making claims and statements in the theological arena. If you have a theological question, maybe you should go to a theologian, not to a physicist. Now that cuts both ways. I'm a chemist. And so, but if you were to ask me a theological question, I would give you my opinion on it, but I would also hand you over to someone like Ken Samples.
So as a Christian who wants to engage these, how should I equip myself? What would you recommend to the Christian or not, someone who wants to be equipped to be able to talk well about the evidence, but recognize they can't be an expert in everything?
I think in today's world, that's much easier because we do have YouTube. We have experts that we can point to with videos. And so it's very simple. I can give somebody the theological nuggets that I've learned and then hand them off and say, here, backing up the reason I believe what I just said to you is because of this person's input. And I can give them links to that video that they can chew on later, or even more rigorous would be an academic paper or a book on the topic. But we have a lot at our disposal now with the internet and the ability to search and find experts in various fields that we can consult.
Hello, Jeff Zwerink, and welcome to Science Faith Connection, the segment of our show where we explore important scientific ideas and see how they relate to the truth of Christianity. Today I'm joined by my friend and colleague Ken Samples, and we're going to explore the question, how do we know Christianity is true? Ken, good to have you here today.
Hi, Jeff.
So there's a lot of world religions out there, and one of the common charges I hear is that one of the reasons why I'm a Christian is because I was simply grew up in a region of the world where Christianity is accepted, and my parents taught me about that. That people aren't Christian over in India because that's not the culture or the worldview over there. Which raises the question, which of the world religions is true, and how would we go about investigating that? How do you respond to that question?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and certainly certain religions have more influence in certain parts of the world than maybe they do in others. I think, however, that's much less true now than it was maybe a couple hundred years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because the world seems smaller. Lots of people come from India, come from Asia, Africa, etc. So I think that's probably less than it used to be. Nevertheless, I think you have to engage in some testing and some analysis. And a way that I like to approach the topic, and again, this isn't the only way you can approach the question of truth, but it's one that I think people can understand and can appreciate. And that is, I take an abductive approach. And what I mean by that is, I ask the question, which worldview, which religion, or secular philosophy, whatever it may be, which worldview makes the best sense of the most meaningful realities of life? And I like to use a single word, clear, C-L-E-A-R, and I look at things like, well, the C is the cosmos. Does this worldview account for maybe the universe's origin?
Mm-hmm.
Does it account for its fine-tuning? Then I move to the L, life. Does this worldview make sense of me, my existential condition, if you will? The E would be ethics. Pretty important. I have a sense of ought, a prescriptive ethic in life. Does that worldview explain that? The A would be abstraction. So logic, science, universal principles. And then the R would be religion, particularly, does it explain the person of Jesus? Because I'm persuaded, Jeff, that when you read the Gospels in a fair-minded way, I think Jesus comes across as the Son of God.
You know, your description sounds very interesting to me in this sense, is that when you delineate these set of categories, or there's things that any sort of religion has to explain.
Yeah.
There's the cosmos, things we know about it. That when you look at things scientifically, one of the things you have to do is not just, can I explain this phenomena, but does my explanation account for all the stuff that's out there? And it seems like you've given a fairly comprehensive thing that says, all right, your whatever worldview or whatever religion you have has to explain all of this data. So how do we evaluate whether a worldview explains that set of data well and come to the conclusion that Christianity is true or false?
Well, I think when you look at it, and I think that my abductive approach is fairly similar to the way scientists look at the world. I mean, scientists use deductive reasoning. Most of the time it's inductive. But I think when you form a hypothesis, you're asking, what is the best explanation for this phenomenon? But I think if you look at it, you can raise the question, does your particular worldview, so for me, does the historic Christian worldview, does it account for these realities? Does it explain or offer an explanation for why these realities are the way they are? Other tests that I would include, are they logical, reasonable? Are they coherent? I mean, I think if your worldview is just jam-packed with contradictions, that's a sign that it's false. Another worldview test that I try to apply is, does this worldview offer what I would call viability or livability? Does this make sense of my personal experiences in life? Does it allow for me as a human being to flourish? So these would be a handful of tests, if you will.
So if I get there's a kind of a universal approach. Does it explain things in the broad picture? But there's also a very personal, does it explain my condition and where I am?
Exactly.
That would be a key feature of how it works.
And I think looking at that anthropology, I mean, I suspect, and I think this for logical reasons, I think a worldview that it can explain the human condition is much more plausible than a worldview that doesn't. Here's an example. Islam does not teach that people are fallen. They don't believe in a radical fall. They don't believe in
okay.
original sin. Well, when I look in the mirror and when I look at the rest of humanity, it seems human beings, as exceptional as they may be, they have a flaw, a moral flaw. I cannot stop sinning. I can't be perfect. Why is that? I think Christianity offers an explanation.
So how, just to kind of exploring this a little bit, in your description, the Christianity explains why we sin, or have at least that selfish nature, if you will. Whereas, a naturalist worldview would say, well, yeah, that just naturally flows out of what we see because people are wanting to survive. So it would seem to have a good explanation for why we behave that way. It just wouldn't call it sin. It would call it the natural order, if you will. So how would Christianity, or what sort of distinction would you make between Christianity and naturalism in that sense?
And I'm glad you raised that, because I think another feature in your worldview is you need some kind of rebuttal to reasonable challenges that come from other particular worldviews. So I'm looking at the anthropology and I'm saying, look, the flawed nature of human beings seems to fit well with Christianity, but a naturalist comes along and says, yes, but evolution, that we're driven by survivability, selfish genes maybe is the explanation. Well, I'm not going to say that doesn't have some explanatory power, but I think I would ask the deeper questions. In a Christian context, we believe, to quote Pascal, the great French thinker, he said humans are great and wretched. We're great in that we seem to be exceptional creatures. We can do math, we can do logic, we can make moral choices, we can create technology. So the human condition is kind of an enigmatic relationship of greatness or being exceptional with the fallenness. And I don't think evolution explains the greatness or the exceptional nature of human beings as well as Christianity does.
So in some sense, that's like a scientific explanation that may explain one set of phenomena, but not the other. So, Islam may have trouble explaining the fallenness of humanity, whereas naturalism can explain that, but it has trouble explaining the glory of humanity, if you will.
Yes.
And so, in the same way a scientific explanation covers all the data, that you're arguing that Christianity does the best job of explaining all the data that's out there.
Yes.
So, I just find it interesting because it sounds a lot like Occam's razor, if you will. You want to find the explanation. The simplest explanation tends to be right, but that simplest explanation actually has to account for all the data that's out there.
That's exactly right. I mean, it's always tempting. I mean, a naturalist, an atheist may say, look, Ken, you have to explain two things. You have to explain the world and God. I just have to explain the world. But of course, the real question is, does your explanatory hypothesis, does your mechanism for explaining things, does it really account for the diverse realities we experience? I think naturalism does explain some things pretty well, but I think it's extremely limited as compared with Christian theism.
So one of the, when we're talking specifically about science, I often use a definition of science that it's a set of tools for exploring the natural world. And of necessity, since we're exploring the natural world, we're trying to find natural explanations of the natural world. Seems to be a reasonably good way of saying, here's the category, or here's how we're going to play this game, if you will. If I get what you're saying, though, when you're talking about a worldview, you need to not only do you have to account for the science, but there are more things you have to get at, like ethics, or why does everybody believe in religion if religion isn't a fundamental part of things? How would you respond to someone who just says, all I need to do is worry about the physical world to take care of things?
Yeah, I think the mistake there in my mind is to do science, you have to start with certain assumptions that can't be justified by science itself. Remember Lawrence Krauss, physicist, well-known scientist, outspoken atheist. He said, the arbiter of all truth is experiment. Well, wait a second. He didn't get that through an experiment. That's an assumption that he started with. I agree, experimentation produces really good results, but the idea that everything or truth can only come through experimentation isn't something that you got from experimentation. So I think when you're doing science, you have to begin with certain ideas that move beyond science itself. I have to be able to trust logic. I have to be able to trust mathematics. I have to be able to trust my mind. I have to believe the universe has order, regularity. Those are starting points. Those are not things we derive from science itself.
Well, thanks, Ken. I really appreciate your comments. You know, there are a lot of religions out there, and the question naturally arises, which of these religions is true and which of them are good? And, you know, Ken has addressed this topic in great detail, and we've just barely scratched the surface here. Would encourage you to go to reasons.org and check out his book, Christianity Cross-Examined. Will give you great tools for exploring how do we test worldviews and come to the one that's actually true.
We hope this episode helped equip you to share your faith with confidence and compassion.
And hey, it was great having you on. I mean, you're just such a natural
Thank
on
you.
camera. And it was a good conversation. You know, I really liked what they were talking about. The Laminin conversation that continues to come up, you know?
Right. That happens in my everyday life, almost every day.
Everyone's asking you about Laminin. Hey, Daniel.
Yeah, that's it. What I thought was really interesting was things that God has put in place that are like almost designed to our core that like show his being.
Well, there's plenty more to unpack with this episode, so don't forget, subscribe to the show and also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We are at 2819 Show. We'd love to hear the big takeaway from this episode.
And you can find us on most major podcast services. Just search Reason to Believe Podcasts.
See you next week.
Bye.